Good morning, everyone. I'm Megan Matheson. I'm the co-lead of the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum Community of Practice and also the Director of Strategy and Engagement for Clear Seas. Please note that this session will be recorded and then posted on our website along with the presentation slides after today's webinar. All the registrants will be notified when the recording is available. Before we get started today, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional ancestral lands of the Snuneymuxw and Ktunaxa First Nations on Vancouver Island and express my gratitude for their stewardship of these lands and waters since time immemorial. To go through some introductions, the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum is a community of practice launched in 2019 with the support of MEOPAR, the Marine Environmental Observation Prediction and Response Network, and hosted by Clear Seas. The community of practice is open to all who are interested in the work of understanding and mitigating shipping risk. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. It's part of a series focused on technology and its role in mitigating shipping risks. If you missed any of the previous sessions, I'll put the link in the chat and you can check them out at your leisure. I'd like to ask everyone to remain muted for the presentation. Afterwards, we'll have time for Q&A, and you're encouraged to raise your hand and unmute, come on video if you like, and ask questions, or if you prefer, please type your questions into the Q&A function or the chat function, and I will read them out for the presenters to respond to. So I'm very pleased to welcome today, we have Alex MacGillivray and Michael Ainslie, both from JASCO. So Alex is a principal scientist at JASCO Applied Sciences in Canada. His research focuses on modeling and measuring underwater noise from ships and predicting soundscapes. He's worked extensively with the Vancouver-based ECHO program on large-scale data sets, operational measures such as the voluntary slowdown, and predictive modeling. Alex also leads international efforts on ship noise measurement standards as a convener of the ISO working group TC43/SC3/WG1 and develops software tools for ship noise prediction used at JASCO. We also have Michael, who is a senior scientist at JASCO Applied Research, a fellow of the Institute of Acoustics, a fellow of the Acoustical Society of America, and a founding member of the EU expert group, Technical Group Noise. His research interests include sonar performance modeling and effects of sound on aquatic life. Michael's recent work involves investigating long-term trends in global ocean sound and their causes. In 2011, he predicted that increasing sea surface temperature would reduce global ocean sound levels and later demonstrated a seasonal temperature-driven effect in the Northeast Pacific. He is the author of a book called Principles of Sonar Performance Modeling, published in 2010. So I'm very pleased to welcome Alex and Michael and like to hand over to both of you to start us off. I believe we'll be starting with Michael and then Alex will pick up the presentation from there. Michael, if you can just
Sorry, I was muted. I beg your pardon. Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you, Megan, for the invitation and for the clear introduction, gracious introduction. The talk is about a project called NAVISON, and the NAVISON project looked at producing sound maps, both in the past, the past and the present and the future. Today we'll be focusing mainly on forecasting sound maps for the future, although you will see some hindcasts as well. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the companies involved in the project. You'll see that the name JASCO appears on all of the slides, but I'd like to emphasize the contribution as well of a sister company, JASCO Ship Consult, and of Marin. And Marin is a Dutch company that specializes in underwater the noise radiated by ships, and they're responsible for a lot of the source modeling that you're going to see. And just trying to regain control over my slides. Yeah, okay. So this is an introductory slide, just explaining what we're going to be talking about. First of all, I'll explain some background, some regulations, international regulations, and an overview of the project. At that point, I'll hand over to Alex, who will talk more about the details of the project. a little bit about the hindcasts and focusing on the forecasts and the relationship that they have with the relationship with how URN measures, mitigation measures for URN, work together with mitigation measures for greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll start with the national regulations. The USA has something called an Ocean Noise Strategy Roadmap, published in 2016. And the purpose of that document is to articulate NOAA's vision for addressing impacts of ocean noise. Canada has its own equivalent strategy also called the Ocean Noise Strategy. And the purpose of that document is to guide future partnerships to minimize impacts of ocean noise. And then the other major national regulation comes from Australia, which has a sustainable ocean plan, whose goal is to protect the environment and to support the economy. And actually, this is the only one I know of that actually puts that emphasis on the economy, a side-by-side protection of the environment. Then we have, in an international context, so NAVISON was produced in an international context. It was produced in the context of the European Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And that is a collaboration between, that is not a collaboration. That is a piece of legislation from the European Union that European member states are required to follow. That is supplemented also by states that are not part of the European Union, but still follow a strategy that's closely aligned to the MSFD, and they all have the goal of achieving or maintaining good environmental status. That includes UK and Norway. And in this context, in the context of URN, of underwater radiated noise, the good environmental status implies that the introduction of energy does not adversely affect the ecosystem. In this case, the energy means underwater noise. And we're talking about the low frequencies, continuous sound aspect of that descriptor. And then the United Nations also has its own body, which develops its own rules, guidelines, and so on. And in particular, there's something called the Marine Environment Protection Committee of the International Maritime Organization. And they're involved in URN management. They produced a set of guidelines in 2014, which was a very high-level document. It was updated in 2023 with a much more detailed set of technical provisions describing describing good practice for minimizing URN. And that was followed by something that they called an experience building phase, and you'll see the initials EBP come up on the odd occasion. And that experience building phase basically seeks synergies between energy efficiency, greenhouse gases, and URN reduction. Right, this slide is about the MSFD, that's the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and it covers the timeline 2008, which was the introduction of the MSFD, up until 2024. I won't go through the entire timeline, but I'm just going to highlight some dates which are relevant, particularly relevant to this project, which ran from 2022 to 2024, and there's an example of a sound map that you see for all of Europe. But I've also included not just the project timeline, but the timeline of the past data, the AIS data that was used to generate these maps for the hindcast aspect of the work. This runs from 2016 to 2023. So there's a total of 8 years AIS data that were used to generate the maps in the past. And then finally, there's the EBP, that's the experience building phase of the IMO, that runs from 2023 to 2026, and that ends this year. Then in parallel with that, there's the IMO timeline, which runs from 2018 to 2025. What you see here on the slide is the greenhouse gas timeline, initial strategy published in 2018, and you can see the adjustment of that in time You can read what's on the screen, but I'll just jump really we're looking mainly at the future. So you can see the objectives here in the future are 20% reduction by 2030, 70% reduction by 2040, and net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And then in parallel with this, there's the URN guidelines, which started well, the provisional guidelines earlier in 2014, but the actual the ones that actually have any detail were published in 2023, and those were approved, I should say, in 2023. An action plan was approved the following year. An action plan by the Subcommittee on Ship Design and Construction, and in 2025, the IACS, which is the International Association of Classification Societies, published its own recommendation, which it was noted by the IMO. That has a slightly different meaning to having been approved by it. And then you see the timeline of the experience building phase as well, and the timeline of the NAVISON project, so that you can see how the timelines relate to one another. Okay, I'll just give a brief overview now of the project and then hand over to Alex. So the name comes from Latin words navis and sonus, which basically means ship sound. It was sponsored by the European Maritime Safety Agency, EMSA, ran from 2022 to 2024, and the goal was to produce shipping sound maps for all European seas, and you can see an example here on the right. The maps were produced for separate regions, and you can see those regions are marked on the top map. In the lower map just shows a map of all of Europe, but it's actually made up of a mosaic of each of the regions merged together. But what's notable is that you don't actually see the join. The hindcast sound maps were made for 2016 to 2023 in the two MSFD frequency bands, 63 Hertz and 125 Hertz. The forecast scenarios, forecast sound maps were made for these 3 years, 2030, 2040, and 2050, with a baseline of 2022. And they were done for one of those two frequencies, namely the 63 Hertz band. There are 5 vessel categories considered, listed here: cargo vessels and bulk carriers, container ships, cruise and passenger vessels, tankers and gas carriers, and roll-on, roll-off vessels. And those 3-letter acronyms you'll see come back again later as part of Alex's presentation. Hopefully there's enough information in the 3-letter acronym to remind you what it was. Mechanisms considered, and this is where Marin's work was vital, because they developed a model for the source level that took into account cavitation of the propeller and machinery noise as separate components, and that enables the model to take into account the difference, the effect on source level of different operational conditions, such as ship speed. And okay, so that's my part done. I'll hand over to Alex at this point.
Thanks,
Alex?
Michael. Yeah, thanks, Michael. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear.
Excellent. Okay. So this slide just gives a high-level overview of our modeling method. And so, as Michael alluded to, we start with data from the Automated Information System, AIS. This is essentially a marine traffic safety system, which probably many of you are familiar with. These data are archived by the member states and shared with EMSA, and we utilize these data for the project. So that's the primary input to the modeling workflow. So next, please, Michael. And these AIS data are then ingested into the ship underwater radiated noise model developed by our project partners at JASCO Ship Consult and Marin, called Piano. And this model separately predicts the radiated noise emissions separately for cavitation and machinery on the vessel to the total radiated noise signature of the vessel. And this model was validated using tens of thousands of ship radiated noise measurements shared by the ECHO program in Vancouver. And so the output of this model, next, please, Michael, was then ingested into JASCO's Artemia soundscape model, which consists of a sound propagation model based on a highly efficient, what we call parabolic equation method, computational approach for modeling how sound propagates from ships into the environment. And this model utilizes environmental data for, bathymetry and oceanographic conditions, controlling sound speed profiles and seabed acoustic properties from open databases such as eModNet and Copernicus. And all of these results of the sound propagation model are used then to generate noise maps. So next, please, Michael. And essentially the output of this Artemia model are three-dimensional data volumes of sound in the ocean, sound and sound pressure level in decibels. And these data volumes have dimensions of longitude, latitude, and depth in the ocean. And so we call these sound map layers, and we calculate these sound map layers by different vessel types, so those 5 vessel types that Michael discussed before, for each source mechanism, cavitation and machinery, by different frequency bands, so 63 hertz and 125 hertz in this case. By season, so we looked at quarterly noise maps over every 3 months in a year, and then by years, and for the forecast by scenarios, which I'll get into later. So next, please, Michael. So the sound map layers, which were produced by the model, were rendered as these noise maps. And these noise maps, so the example shown on the left here, this is a noise map showing the sound pressure level, again, in decibels. This is the sound pressure level totaled, aggregated over all 5 ship categories, as Michael said, as a mosaic over the entire European continent. You'll see there's an animation that actually flashes through each year. So these are our yearly average noise maps. So there's a lot in these noise maps. And so we seek a summarizing metric, a way of taking information over this vast scale, and again, divided into all these different source mechanisms, ship types. So we use a metric which we call sound energy density. And what this simply is, and this is the quantity shown on the bar on the right now, and I'll explain that shortly. What this simply is this is the total sound energy in the ocean divided by the volume of seawater in the model. And we consider the upper 200 meters of the ocean as being the most relevant for good environmental status. And you can see on the bar chart to the right now, we've taken the total sound energy density of that entire noise map, and then for each year, we've separated up the contribution of each of our 5 different vessel categories. So blue being cargo vessels, the orange being container vessels, passenger vessels are in the yellow there, very thin. There's not too many of them. And then there's the roll-on, roll-off vessels in purple, and the tankers and gas carriers in green. And so you can see there's definitely changes year over year in the total sound in the modeling region. In 2020, you can see there's a definite dip associated with COVID, and so this is the primary output of the hindcast portion of the model. So if you go to the next slide, please, Michael. So that leads us then into our forecast scenarios. So as Michael said, we based our forecast scenarios on a baseline year of 2022 from those hindcast predictions that we just showed. And so we considered 4 different forecast scenarios. The first scenario was what we call our business as usual scenario. And this just considers increasing traffic over time with no change to the vessel design associated with either greenhouse gas emissions management or radiated noise management. And this is sort of our baseline scenario against which we can evaluate our management scenarios. So the next scenario, next please, Michael. So our scenario 2 was the greenhouse gas emissions roadmaps. And this is based on the International Maritime Organization, IMO's GHG emissions roadmap scenario, which considers different management measures to reduce fuel consumption and GHG emissions, which I'll get to more in the next slide. Our third scenario, next please, Michael, was a underwater radiated noise management scenario where we don't consider, so that's just URN management in isolation, where we don't consider the effect of these GHG management measures. So now we're looking at specific measures that are targeted to noise emissions reduction. And then our final scenario 4, next please, Michael, was our combined scenario of URN management plus the GHG emissions roadmap, where we considered in total 6 different measures to reduce emissions of GHGs and URN together. And so if you go to the next slide, please. So the 6 measures that we considered or discussed here are presented here. And so these included the first measure we we considered was speed reductions. This is just essentially slowing the speeds of the vessels. This is actually a measure that's effective for both greenhouse gas emissions reduction and radiated noise reduction. This is an operational measure, meaning it doesn't require any change to the design of the vessel. The next measure we considered was hull and propeller cleaning. This is essentially biofouling management. This is specifically a measure intended to target greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And again, this is an operational measure that would not require any design changes to the vessel. The third measure that we evaluated was more efficient propellers, and more efficient in terms of fuel consumption. And this is, again, specifically a greenhouse gas reductions measure. This is a change to the vessel design, and so would require retrofit of existing vessels and changes to the design of new build vessels. The fourth measure we considered, again, a greenhouse gas reductions measure, was optimized hull forms. This is changing the hull form of the vessel to improve fuel economy. Again, this is a design measure. The fifth measure we considered, which is air injection, essentially bubbles around the hull and propeller for essentially creating a barrier to reduce radiation of propeller and machinery noise. And this is, again, a measure that requires some modification to the vessel design. And this is specifically a radiated noise abatement measure. And the final measure that we considered was quieter propellers. So propellers, by and large, the largest single source of noise emissions on a marine vessel. And so by changing the propeller design, you can optimize to reduce radiated noise emissions. So we considered quieter propellers as being a specific noise abatement measure. The important point to note is that in this project, and as we'll discuss more later, we considered the more fuel efficient propeller and the quieter propeller to be essentially exclusive options. You can have one or the other, but you cannot have both. And we'll get into a bit more why we considered it that way. But those are the 6 measures that we considered in our model. And the important point also to consider here is that the way we used we used this very sophisticated source model piano. So for each individual vessel that was in the AIS record, we could assess the changes in URN that depended both on the vessel design and on the instantaneous operating condition of the vessel from the AIS record. So piano allows a very granular approach of assessing how these measures would affect the radiated noise emissions of individual vessels. So next slide, please. So in developing our forecast scenarios, the way we implemented these measures was considering them in terms of a penetration rate. So the penetration rate is the percentage of vessels in the fleet of a particular class of vessel that would have adopted a particular measure. And so this now is showing an example of the inputs we use for the combined greenhouse gas emissions and radiated noise management scenario. And so what you can see is that for each horizon year in our forecast, 2030, 2040, and 2050, and for each category of vessel, we assigned a particular penetration rate to each of our 6 measures to vessels in the model, and those penetration rates change over time, and again, independently in each category, and where the adoption of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, again, guided by that roadmap, and the radiated noise emissions management measures, again, assuming realistic rates of adoption. You'll note that none of our scenarios ever consider 100% adoption of these measures. So there's some measures are more feasible to adopt by more members of the fleet than others. And the other thing to note again is that you'll see that rates of adoption increase over time. But in this particular scenario, we see that more efficient propellers are adopted more quickly in terms of our horizon years, and then quieter propellers then become predominant later towards the 2050 scenarios. So this is, again, an example of one of the scenarios that we considered. So next slide, please, Michael. So having produced, so we can take those penetration rates, we put them into our model, and we produce these forecast sound maps. And what we find is that if you were just to put the forecast sound map and the baseline sound map or the business as usual sound map side by side, it'd be very difficult to discern a difference. So what we do is we subtract one sound map, the sound level from one sound map from the other, to visualize the difference, the delta, if you will, between the 2 scenarios. So this slide here shows now our different sound maps between our between our three different forecast scenarios and the business as usual scenario, focusing again on the 60 hertz band for 2030, 2040, and 2050. And in the two rows, the top row shows our scenarios for 2030. The bottom row shows our scenarios for 2050. And again, this is aggregated over all vessel categories. What you see by and large is that under all scenarios, there is an overall reduction indicated by the blue colors, although in some locations there's a mild increase indicated by the more red colors. A white indicates no change, and you see, of course, the reductions are greatest in the underwater radiated noise management scenario, and in the greenhouse gas emission scenario, there are some locations where you actually do see a slight increase in noise versus the combined and radiated noise management scenarios. So then again, there's a lot in here. These are just yearly averages, but we have, of course, sound map layers for the individual chip types. So if you go to the next slide, please, Michael. Again, to look at these in aggregate, what we did, again, use that sound energy density metric. And then what we do is we look at how that sound energy density metric changes over time in each of these 5 vessel categories. And so what these charts here show, again, for each of our 3 scenarios that are different from our business as usual scenario, we show the change in the total sound energy density. Again, this is over all European seas, reference to that business as usual scenario at our 3 time horizons, 2030, 2040, 2050. And of course, there's no change at our reference year of 2022. And now each of the different colors on these charts show how much the sound energy density either increases as a positive percentage or decreases as a negative percentage relative to the baseline. So we have, again, our 3 scenarios: the greenhouse gas emissions reduction scenario on the left, the radiated noise management scenario in the middle, and the combined scenario on the right. And on the green, there is the tankers and gas carriers category. The orange represents the container vessels category, blue representing cargo vessels, yellow representing passenger vessels, and purple representing roll-on, roll-off vessels. And in the black is the total all over 5 vessel categories. And so what's interesting to note here is that, in fact, so next, please, Michael. We see actually that, again, in this greenhouse gas emissions reduction scenario, for certain categories, specifically the tankers and the container vessels, we actually do see an increase in radiated noise relative to the business as usual scenario when we only consider greenhouse gas emissions in isolation. And the reason for this is because there is a trade-off in propeller design between fuel efficiency and noise emissions. And this is there's some excellent work by our colleagues at Marin that go into more detail discussing this, which we can go into potentially after the conclusion of the presentation. But the key point being is that when we consider these scenarios combined on the right, then when we consider that we have fleets that use both more efficient propellers and noise-reducing propellers, we can still achieve an overall reduction in the forecast scenarios in the radiated noise in the ocean. And there's a lot more detail in here, of course, that it would be available in our final report, but this is the very high level. So next slide, please, Michael. So just in terms of conclusions of our study, so there's a number of takeaways. Again, this is several years of work, and so there's some very high level takeaways which I'll leave with you today. The first is that, again, looking at those noise maps that were presented earlier, just based on our existing hindcasts, we can identify where are the noise hotspots in European seas right now. And we can focus on areas like the English Channel, the Strait of Gibraltar, the Dardanelles, and some regions of the Baltic Sea where there's high concentrations of shipping. And these actually are the locations with the highest existing sound levels. We also can identify locations with lower sound levels, where there's sparser shipping, the northwest part of the Northeast Atlantic, the southern Mediterranean, and the east part of the Black Sea. One caveat, which is important to note here, is, again, these forecasts only consider the 5 categories of shipping that we discussed earlier, and these are sort of essentially large commercial merchant vessels. There are, of course, smaller vessels like shipping vessels, which are not represented in these noise maps, which may be present in different areas and may contribute to the soundscape as well. In terms of how the environment influences the sound propagation. Essentially, what we demonstrated is that the bathymetry, which is just the ocean depth, is quite influential, and we find that the sound level values were lower in deeper parts of our noise maps, particularly in the Ionian Sea, in the Bay of Biscay, when we consider similar source levels for the vessels. And this is because the sound is more diffuse over a larger area of ocean. The other thing we found is that the sea surface temperature is quite influential in terms of sound propagation. So if you have cooling at the sea surface in winter, this can enhance sound propagation, whereas in summer, where the sea surface temperature is warming, this actually weakens sound propagation and lowers sound levels. And finally, when we're looking at our different mitigation measures in our forecast scenarios, again, one of the major conclusions is that when we're looking at specifically our greenhouse gas reductions emission scenario, more efficient propellers can increase the average source levels for some categories of vessels, again, because there's a potential trade-off between radiated noise reductions and greenhouse gas emissions. And so when we look at our combined scenario, which implements measures addressing both URN and GHGs, following that initial increase associated with the uptake of more efficient propellers, we found this energy decreased for later forecast years as an increasing proportion of the vessels were equipped with a quieter propeller rather than a more efficient one. And the last thing I'll point out is our study findings were based on the IMO's 2018 greenhouse gas strategy or roadmap. They have actually published a revised strategy in 2023. So there's potential in future, these noise maps potentially could be updated to consider a different roadmap or a different GHG strategy. And that's all I have for you today. So next, please, Michael. Before concluding the presentation, of course, I want to acknowledge that the funding from this project came from the European Maritime Safety Agency, EMSA, and our project director was Sami Davidnia. And you can find the final report from this project that essentially contains all the information from this presentation on the EMSA website at the link shown here. And of course, we'd like to acknowledge especially the Port of Vancouver, who granted permission to use the source levels for the validation of the radiated noise model used in NAVISON. So thanks very much, and I'll leave it there for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael and Alex. That's a really fascinating presentation, and I think a really important way to look at how one mitigation measure can affect another potential outcome. So we are quite a small, intimate group today. So I'd like to encourage, if anybody wants to turn their camera on and ask questions directly, you're very welcome to do that. Hello, Jack. Nice to see you. Hello. And I can start us off with a few questions. And anybody who would like to ask questions also, please feel free to raise your hand and we can just go ahead and do that. So I'm thinking back to where you were assigning different uptake rates for each vessel type, for each technology. How did you decide, how many tankers were likely to have more efficient propellers by a certain time? What sort of metrics did you use to guide those decisions or assumptions?
Do you want me to speak to this one, Michael?
Yes, please.
Right. So the first thing I'll say is, again, so Thomas Lloyd, one of our collaborators, couldn't be here. Ultimately, he led those. He led the design of those scenarios. But again, for greenhouse gas emissions specifically, this was based on that IMO roadmap. For radiated noise emissions measures, though, there's obviously a bit more judgment in there. And one of the things I didn't touch on in this presentation, actually, that was a key innovation of our project, actually. So these scenarios that we presented in this report considered a particular set of penetration rates. But actually, the way that the calculation was undertaken, it's possible for us, with all the layers that have been calculated from this project, to actually evaluate other scenarios very rapidly. So we gave the tools to EMSA that, and again, the hope is that the member states of the EU could use this to evaluate different scenarios. So these penetration rates are not set in stone. Given the noise layers from the project and the tools that we provided to EMSA, it's actually possible with some very quick GIS calculations to evaluate different scenarios with different penetration rates involving these same measures for, again, other forecast scenarios. So again, these penetration rates that we evaluated were based on sort of our best available information about what realistic rates of adoption in future would be. But obviously, any forecast, there's some guesswork involved, and so that's why we essentially delivered this flexible approach that would allow different measures or different penetration rates of these measures to be evaluated as well.
It's really nice to think about the flexibility and how this could be applied in different situations, that it is possible to adjust those different levers and see how that would impact different technologies.
Yeah.
Thinking about the business as usual case, how did you come to determine the increase in shipping traffic for that case as your way of evaluating, with more ships, with more activity, there's going to be more noise. So how did you come up with those values?
So those were based simply on just an overall increase in shipping volumes. We didn't actually change the composition of ships in the baseline data that we had. I can't recall exactly where, those we didn't end up those forecasts whole cloth. They did come from, I believe, IMO projections, but if someone's interested, I believe that information is in the report as to exactly where those sort of future forecasts of increased shipping volume came from.
Yeah, just to add to that, the information that we used came directly from EMSA.
Mm.
So we just used the values that advised by EMSA. Where EMSA got the values from, it may well be from our IMO projections.
Yeah,
but
I might have misspoken there.
Okay, we'll have to look up at the report. Yeah, I'm curious because I'm based on the west coast of Canada, and we've seen some recent changes in ship composition. And so thinking about, what kinds of ships are you going to be seeing in an area, and if there's a dramatic change in one particular area, like the LNG tankers in Douglas Channel, how is that going to impact the noise in an area? So it'd be interesting and I think that the way that this has been set up, it would be possible to modify some of those values to test out different cases potentially.
Yeah, that's the idea, is essentially using this layered approach to superimpose different layers of shipping traffic or different types of mitigations on top of a baseline. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Charlotte, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex and Michael. I wanted to ask how you decided on is it the piano model that's used for the source levels? How did you come up with what is a quieter propeller or the air injections? Is that based on measurements of quieter propellers, or is that just kind of an estimate that you've made based on kind of what we know?
So yeah, hi Charlotte. Yeah, that's a good question. So there's some work. Obviously, that piano model, Thomas Lloyd, again, our collaborator from Marin, led that development. But there are papers that he's got. You could probably look those up that describe. But the model is essentially physics based. So Marin, essentially they specialize particularly with propeller design and how the changes in the design would affect radiated noise emissions among other things. So it's based on their laboratory experience and their work with propeller optimization design. And piano is a physics-based model. So what it's doing is it's starting from essentially a baseline propeller design, and they're looking at how these modifications might change the radiated noise using a physical model that's actually parameterized in terms of the physics. So it's not just some fudge factor. It really is looking at the specifics of the propeller design for a class of vessel. So obviously we don't have detailed propeller design information for every vessel, but Marin's got pretty good information about the kinds of propulsion that are typically used on vessels in these areas, and so they were able to come up with an assessment again based on their work in the actual physics of cavitation and radiated noise emission. I believe Michael dropped a link to one of those papers in the chat there. No, excellent question. Thank you, Charlotte. Hope that answered it okay. Again, without Thomas here, I can't give a
No,
really
I
definitive answer.
I was wondering if it was related to what Marin were working on, because I know they
It
did a
is.
lot in the Saturn project looking at the air injection stuff. So I wondered if that was maybe feeding into this piano model. And yeah, thanks, Michael. I'll have a read of that link.
Yeah, so Charlotte, this model was developed specifically for this NAVISON project, but the
Mhm.
timeline is in parallel with Saturn, as you could tell.
Yeah.
So they're bound internally. They will have fed on each other's knowledge as developed during both projects. But
No,
that
that's
was
really
that's
cool. I
all
mean, it's really
internal to
cool to
Mars.
see the bits of work coming from one project and another project and all feeding in together to work towards something else. So yeah, I think it's really cool. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I love that part where you've got all of these different people working on underwater noise and GHGs, and you're bringing all these components together, like the echo program data as well. Jack, you have a question.
Yes, so thanks a lot. This is an area that I'm not very familiar. I'm a mariner, and so create this kind of noise and stuff. So I'm just interested in how you deal with it. One question I have, and I don't know, I'm just looking for a simple answer, but what happens to sound propagation in places where there's high levels of ambient noise, in places where there's high tidal currents and that kind of stuff? Does that affect the propagation of noise that's coming from the ship?
So the ambient noise doesn't affect the sound from the ship. What it does do is it presents a baseline which would raise the background. So in the picture, can you see, is the picture visible to you, that showing the map of Europe changing with time? Is that still sharing?
Yeah.
Yes.
So what you see is some really dark regions, some blue and sometimes even black colors. Now, if there were high ambient noise, the levels of the brighter colors, the yellows and the greens, would be completely unaffected by that. But the dark colors would be raised by the presence of ambient noise. Now, there's one important aspect that hasn't been mentioned actually is that this is only the sound from ships. There's a natural background that's there present all the time from wind, and that will fill in some of these darker regions. And that's there. That's present 24/7. The wind never goes away. And even if it's not windy locally, there's wind further away that will fill in the gaps anyway. If there are other contributions to the ambient noise, then that will also have the similar effect. So what one should ideally do is to create a map showing the sum of the two, the wind and the ships, and perhaps any other contributors. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just know that some work that we were trying to do in the Bay of Fundy, and once we got underwater, the background noise level from the water and things rolling along the bottom and whatnot was just confounding to some of the instrumentation we were trying to use. So I just wondered if when you get into these areas where there are high tidal currents, like north of Scotland, they would have the same, whether that affects how that sound reacts when it hits the water coming from the ship. Like, does it interfere with that? Does it amplify it? Does it cause any kind of change to the sound that's coming from the ship?
I think it's more an effect that will occur at the receiver of the sound that will be physically affected by the presence of flow. So it makes it more difficult to record the sound with a physical hydrophone in the presence of high flow. But this is all modeled work, so we're not impeded in any way by effects like flow noise. This is the actual sound coming from the ships that's not influenced by flow noise, but it becomes very hard to measure under certain circumstances. Yeah, that is certainly true.
Yeah. And I haven't had a chance to look at the paper that was dropped in the chat yet, but I'm interested in hearing more about this differentiation between fuel efficient propellers and quiet propellers and what the basic difference is, I guess, between them.
So for that, I think this slide, this slide speaks to that subject. The slide is made by Maren, who are the experts on this subject, and it shows the effect of thousands of different realizations of propeller designs, showing scattergram of source level for each realization, source level on the y-axis versus efficiency on the x-axis. And what you can see is that as you increase, if you hug on the bottommost curve, right, which is the lowest source level and the highest efficiency, as you go to the right, you're forced, if you stay on the red curve, if you want to get higher efficiency, you're forced to use a more noisy propeller. And vice versa, if you want to reduce the source level, you're forced to use a lower efficiency. That's if you're on the red part. If you start in the blue region, then there's paths through which you can gain a higher efficiency and a lower source level, but only if you start with a very poor propeller. And I honestly don't know where we are in this rainbow color, whether we're starting in the blue part or starting close to the red. I suspect that we're not actually close to the red, because this is really a new subject. Well, actually, I shouldn't say it's a new subject. Navies have studied this for decades, but they don't usually the navies don't make public the knowledge that they've learned. So it's new for the open access literature.
Well, and the ship owners are interested in efficiency because it saves them fuel, and that's big money. Saving 1% of their fuel is huge economic benefit, but they've never had to think about noise before, so they've chased the efficient propellers, those that will help them, minimize fuel expenditure.
Indeed, yeah.
I wanted to ask a quick follow-up, just while we're on the topic of quieter propellers versus more efficient propellers. You mentioned assuming that more ships would have quieter propellers by the time we got to 2050. Why did you make that assumption? Why do you think that is? Why would ships switch from the more efficient to the quieter?
Alex?
That's a good question. I actually, and this is where I would defer to Thomas and Sammy. The particulars of why we use those particular penetration rates, I don't have those. I don't have those on hand. And again, other than just to go back to my previous point, which is that again, these forecasts involve a particular set of assumptions. They're not set in stone, and it's possible to evaluate different scenarios. This is just one possible future where we have measures that address both. But obviously we looked at different forecasts. And in fact, IMO doesn't have a roadmap for radiated noise right now. The only roadmap that really is clear is the GHG emissions. So I guess there's some obviously there's some latitude there, but yeah. So I can't speak to the specifics, but I encourage anyone to look at the report and.
It is interesting to think about, as we are currently, as you say, with a GHG roadmap, but without an EARN roadmap, and how does that affect decision making? As Jack pointed out, ship operators are thinking about their cost and the regulations that are in place, and it's hard to also think about regulations that aren't yet in place and how you meet those competing constraints.
Yeah. And in the European context, of course, they do have a regulation in place, which is this Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which compels them to try and adhere to good environmental status for different habitat areas. So it's not hard to imagine that perhaps the rate of uptake would be, driven by the need to meet that good environmental status as well. So, but I think there's some latitude for the member states as to how they implement that. Michael can speak more to that context than I.
Yeah, I mean, there's complete latitude. Each member state is required to achieve or maintain good environmental status. So that if they already have it, there's no need to do anything. But if they don't have it, then they're required to take measures. But the precise measures that they adopt is up to them, with just one caveat, and that is that they are required to do so in collaboration with their neighbors for any one region. So, for example, in the Baltic Sea, the Baltic states are supposed to work together to achieve the goal.
Thierry, you have a question.
Yeah, hello, Thierry Marquil, Müller BBM. I have a question on the ship categories. So I wanted to know how you came up on these 5 ones, and if in a further up project, would you change them and maybe add some sizes to classify the ships? If you could just comment on that. That's my first question.
Alex, that's for you as well, I think.
Yeah, I think again the approach is high level. I mean, we could certainly have subdivided each of these, if, for example, if you wanted to do a different categorization or by size, that's certainly something we could have done. But again, the project itself, we were considering many different scenarios, many different years. The amount of data, I mean, just to give you some perspective, even with just what we've presented here today, this resulted in thousands of computations of sound map layers, of constituent sound map layers. So there's some computational trade-off with the granularity of the model and the aims of the project. So certainly there's nothing in the methodology that would limit us from doing some kind of different subdivisions. But these 5, I think, that was what we broadly agreed to with EMSA that would be most useful for member states. And certainly, the model includes all different kinds of vessels that are actually present in AIS and of all different sizes of vessels. Just how we chose to categorize them in terms of layering them in the sound maps. That's the important distinction here. So I don't know if that's something that would be considered in future, but again, there's when you have a project like this, we sort of picked a specific scope that was the intent would to be for it to be broadly useful to different member states, but different stakeholders might have different needs, so it's a compromise.
Okay, thank you. No, that's fine. I completely understand it. Also, the effort you have done, that's I see that is very high already. And the last question is regarding the 63 hertz and 125 hertz. I know that it was set by EMSA, but there again, I would rather tend to use some maybe frequency bands better to get a more overall view on maybe not misleading. I know in that your report that for the 125 hertz, that's the changes between tankers being the loudest changes a bit. So
yeah, and again, it comes back to that same point, which is that we had to sort of draw a line in this somewhere because the computational effort, again, this took several years to produce these noise maps, and there's quite a bit of computational effort in there. But yes, and there's no reason that we couldn't, with this methodology, look at other frequency bands and expand the scope. So this is the goal here was really to address the MSFD and the member state requirements in the most direct way. But yes, absolutely. I think for future phases and other projects, we certainly looked at other frequency bands as well.
Regarding ship propellers, I would expect cavitation noise also be important at high frequencies. So the question was how the reduction in propeller noise, cavitation noise affects these low frequency ranges.
Right. I think I mean Michael may want to speak to this as well, but the thing that tends to drive this is, and I think there's often a misconception that the MSFD bands they're not intended to be the be all and end all, but they are intended to be sort of indicator bands. And the advantage of these low frequencies is particularly when you get into the deeper ocean, they are the frequencies that propagate the farthest. So these are in some ways a conservative indicator of the prevalence of shipping noise, because these are the frequencies where actually wind noise tends to be lower relative to shipping noise. Like shipping noise dominates in these bands over a very wide region. If we were to look at higher frequencies, again, cavitation is very broadband noise. It can be, tens of kilohertz up 100 kilohertz sound. It covers a very wide range. Those higher frequencies are attenuated a lot more rapidly with distance. And so if we were looking at mapping of this scale, if we were to consider very high frequencies, there wouldn't be the same prevalence of shipping noise. And so again, we're addressing the MSFD bands. The reason they're chosen is because they're meant to be an indicator or an index of the prevalence of shipping noise, but not necessarily encompass all of it. I don't know, Michael, if you have anything to add to that.
Only to say that it isn't only at high frequencies that you run into trouble. So if you go above about 200 hertz, say, in deep water, you very quickly run into a region where it's dominated by wind. And so there's little point in calculating sound maps for only ships unless you also calculate the wind to see where the ships actually matter. Whereas in this frequency band, 63 to 125, you can be fairly confident that pretty much everywhere it will be dominated by ships. But what I wanted to add to that is that it's not only at high frequency that's true, but if you go to lower frequencies, lower than about 40 hertz, you also start to see other sources that start to matter. And in particular, baleen whale calls start to have a huge influence on the soundscape at the lower frequencies, especially around 20 hertz with the fin whale calls. And so you run into trouble at both ends. So it's kind of a safe frequency range. I would say that it would be nice to fill in the gaps at 80 hertz and 100 hertz. That's the first thing that I think would be good, because you see in some situations the level at 63 goes down and the level 125 might also go down, but the level at 80 or 100 might be going up because some feature has moved in frequency as you've introduced a mitigation method. That is a serious concern. And if you read our report, you'll see that concern described in more detail. Have we put a link to the report anywhere? Is that something we should do?
There was a QR code at the end, but if anybody didn't catch that, it'd be probably great if you could drop the link into the chat. And I can make sure to link to it on the webpage once we get the recording up.
Yeah.
Find it easily.
Okay, so if anyone wishes to take a snapshot of this, they can do that. But I will also put the link in the chat.
I have a last question on smaller vessels. So this is focused on larger commercial vessels where AIS data is available. But you mentioned smaller vessels. There are quite a lot of small fishing vessels, pleasure craft, other types of vessels that are small and don't use AIS. If it was possible to track their presence in some other way, like through the Global Fishing Watch or satellite or some other camera visual tracking, would it be possible to input that data into the sound forecasting to get a sense of what the sound mapping is for smaller vessels?
Michael, do you want to speak to this, or you want me to?
I'd like you to, actually, if you can. Sure. It's a tough one.
Yeah, no, but the Global Fishing Watch, that's I'm glad that you raised that. That's because that would be my first response to that question is, so when we're talking about smaller vessels, they often do not have AIS, or at least very few of them do. And so you need to look at alternate data sources. And I think Global Fishing Watch, they've put out some very excellent publications recently, and they work with essentially satellite remote sensing data, both visual and radar set data, and essentially the aim there is to capture these vessels which are not tracked otherwise. And so absolutely it would be possible, I believe, to take those detections, from the maps that they've produced and to do some sort of similar calculation. We haven't incorporated that in this project. The piano model, I believe, really is still geared toward these larger merchant vessels, which would be the focus of these IMO discussions. But absolutely, in a lot of regions, it is going to be smaller vessels, particularly fishing vessel fleets that might be important. So that's something that absolutely could be tackled in a frame of something like this NAVISON project, but is not something we attempted. But that would be the way to do it for sure.
Well, any project ends with a suggestion for future research.
Yeah. I'm glad that Global Fishing Watch data set was raised, because it's really that really is the frontier, I think, in terms of just understanding global ship movements, because AIS is a tremendous resource, but I think sometimes it is lost that there are a lot of regions where there's a lot of vessels that aren't in that system. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Well, thank you so much. We're at the end of our time for today. I want to respect everyone's time to get on with their day. So really appreciate you taking the time to share this project with us. And thanks to everyone for your participation and all the great questions. As I mentioned before, we'll have the recording and slides posted on the CMSRF website, and I'll send out the links to everyone who registered for today's session. And looking to the future, our next webinars are going to be focused more on technology for navigational safety. So sign up for our mailing list. I put the link in the chat if you'd like to be notified when available. All right. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Megan.
Thanks everyone for joining.